Hello to my abnormal psych students. It's been a few days. I was a little bit under the weather, not COVID, just a stomach thing, but I'm feeling better. Hope you're all doing well. And um, last week, maybe you watched, we talked about mood disorders and specifically different types of depression. So tonight we're going to talk about bipolar disorder. And let me just say to you that going back a couple of videos, I started it off by talking about normal mood, mania, and depression in different levels. So we're going to reference that a little bit later tonight again. If you haven't watched that, you should see that first. You'll be getting an email from me also about your fourth case study, which and I'll give you there's a choice. You can do either dysthymic disorder, which we discussed in the last video, or you could do bipolar disorder from the casebook, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight for a little bit. Okay, but that'll be a separate email that I'll send you. And to just start, bipolar disorder is under the general category in the DSM-5 of mood disorders. And you all have heard of bipolar disorder. It's a disorder that has been discussed a lot and researched a lot, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. It used to be called manic depression. It was that term was changed a number of years ago. Part of what happens is terms sometimes take on all kinds of meaning in the popular culture that they don't really mean, and so the terms get changed up. But essentially, whether you call it bipolar disorder or manic depression, it's a mood disorder that's characterized by extreme mood swings. And those mood swings can vary from normal mood to depression, and then other periods of time when a person experiences what appears to be the opposite of depression, which is mania. And really, the bipolar disorder is divided into several different subtypes, and we'll get into those in just a little bit. Let me give you a really good website reference if you want to get kind of a quick picture of the bipolar disorder. It's nimh.nih.gov. nimh.nih.gov. That's the website of the National Institute of Mental Health, and it's got some really good information on the bipolar disorder. So to start with, it's a serious disorder. Untreated bipolar disorder is associated with many different negative life outcomes. And we're going to see this again down the road when we cover schizophrenia. They're two different disorders, though they may share some genetic pieces in common. That's not quite certain yet, but they may. But they are two different disorders with different sets of symptoms, but they are both serious psychological disorders that tend to get worse without treatment. Now, we covered that idea last week when we talked about major depression. And so that's also true for ordinary major depression, also called unipolar disorder. Uni means one, right? That disorder also tends to get worse without treatment. But that's certainly true for the bipolar disorder. So early diagnosis and thorough comprehensive treatment is a very important part of dealing with bipolar disorder. And also, bipolar disorder is a little like becoming diabetic. If you develop diabetes at 20, barring some, unusual situation, you're going to be dealing with being diabetic for the rest of your life. And that is generally true with the bipolar disorder. If its most common age of onset is late adolescence, although it can occur in children. It's a tough diagnosis in children because if you think about it, children have a lot of mood swings in general, so it can be hard to see the bipolarity because it's being expressed through some of the normal behaviors of being a child. It historically with kids, it's also sometimes been misdiagnosed as ADHD initially, and only down the road does it become clear that it's really a bipolar issue. A lot of folks with bipolar disorder were misdiagnosed for years before the correct diagnosis was made. So, but it is a serious disorder. Um, and as you already know, it involves mood extremes. Now, one thing to understand is bipolar folks sometimes are in normal mood. They're not always too far up or too far down, right? But there are other periods of time when they sink into a significant depression, which looks at that moment like an ordinary major depression. But then what distinguishes it is there will be other periods of time when a bipolar person will move from normal into the manic phase of the disorder. If in depression we don't have enough energy, in mania we have far too much energy, which leads to a lot of untreated, a lot of chaotic behavior and a lot of dysregulation. There's also an interesting link between bipolarity and creativity. It's been known for some time that highly creative human beings, think for example, real poets or artists, are more likely to struggle with bipolar issues. Now, I'm not saying that to be creative you have to be bipolar. By no means is that true. But on the flip side, there is some kind of connection between having these extreme ups and downs and the ability to connect with kind of that emotional, creative spirit. And that's especially true for poets, real poets, not like me. I can make dirty limericks, but real poets are significantly more likely to have the symptoms of bipolar disorder in adulthood. So it's an interesting kind of link. And, it's one of those things where there's real suffering in untreated bipolar disorder, absolutely. But it also has this some kind of link to the creative soul, which is interesting to read about. So we're going to divide the bipolar spectrum into three different disorders. And let me start first with a disorder that is technically in the DSM not called the bipolar disorder, but think of it as a very mild form of bipolarity. It's called the cyclothymic, cyclothymic disorder, also known as cyclothymia. And the term gives it away, right? Cyclo meaning to cycle. People who are cyclothymic have periods of time when they have what looks to be dysthymia, or the dysthymic disorder that we talked about, but also other periods of time when they become hypomanic. And if you go back to the chart from a couple of weeks ago on mood, hypomania, to just remind you, is mild mania, not severe mania, but milder mania. So they cycle up and down, not like this to this, but more like this to this. My 24-pound cat, Summit, just arrived in the room. There he is. Yes. Yes, sweet boy. Okay. So cyclothymia would be, it's people who are often described from childhood as just very moody, up and down a lot. Some of those folks might actually be cyclothymic and just never, it's not viewed as a disorder. It's viewed as just kind of a way of being in the world. But if you begin to take cyclothymia and make the ups and the downs more extreme, then you move into the bipolar disorder. And currently in the DSM-5, there are two different types of bipolar disorder, type 1 and type 2. It would not surprise me that someday when the DSM-6 is published, or when the 5 is revised, that may change a little bit. In bipolar type 1, the depression is significant. It's major depression. But when the person goes manic, they don't go into a full manic episode. They develop hypomania. So the depressions are significant, moderate to severe, but the mania is mild. It's not high-level manic excitement. It's a milder level of mania. And if I just said to you that was type 1, that was my mistake. That's actually type 2. So let me review that. Type 2 is characterized by hypomania or mild mania, and then other periods of time of major depression. Type 1 bipolar is the full spectrum. So in type 1 bipolar disorder, when a person is depressed, they're significantly depressed. They have the symptoms of major depression. But in type 1, when a person goes manic, they go into full-on, full-blown manic excitement, high levels of mania. And so because a person with type 1 has such extreme ups and extreme downs, they're a higher risk group for negative life outcomes. Now, that's also true with type 2 because the depressions are severe. But in type 1, because the mania is so significant, in a full-on manic episode, a person is capable of behaving in ways that are at least temporarily psychotic, and so their judgment and insight will often be significantly impaired. I might have mentioned to you early in the semester a client of mine years ago, an elderly woman who, in a full-on manic excitement phase of her bipolar disorder, took her entire life savings and sent it off, cashed it out and sent it off in $100 bills to a TV evangelist that's on in the middle of the night, and basically lost all her money. And that's just a very painful example of the sort of bad decision making that can go with full-on manic excitement. So we've got those two different types. Now, the other thing I want to add is there's a subset of people with bipolar disorder who are called rapid cyclers. And rapid cyclers can go from full on up to full on down and back again in relatively short periods of time. For many people who are bipolar, who are not rapid cyclers, the major depression may last for months, and the manic phase may last for weeks, sometimes longer, but often, much shorter than the depressive phase. But people who are rapid cyclers are an extra high risk group because their mood is so unstable, they can kind of be all over the place. And there's other diagnostic components like mixed type bipolar. And if you're really interested into digging into that, go to the website that I mentioned to you before, and you can learn more about that. So this disorder, bipolar disorder, is a great example of how complex life is and how complex etiology is. In the old days, read 50, 60 years ago, there was an old theory about being bipolar, which really kind of came out of psychodynamic theory, aka Freud and others. And it was basically the idea, which is not correct, that bipolar people were really simply people who were very depressed and had major depression, who would use mania or going manic as a defense mechanism against their depression. So years ago, there was this theory that basically argued that the fundamental problem for people who were diagnosed bipolar was that they were depressed. They had severe depression, like lots of folks do. But psychologically, as a way to try to escape, they would flee into mania. It was called a flight into mania. And so going from having no energy, ego dystonic, painful depression, to being full of energy and going 200 miles an hour and running around often without a real clear focus and getting very active was almost a way psychologically of pushing the depression away, right? Distancing from the depression. Now, I think we can probably all relate to that a little bit. I bet some of you, when you're going through rough times and you're starting to your mood is starting to drop, try to get busy, right, as a way to distract yourself. Take that same idea and make it far more extreme. That was one of the older theories of depression. What those older theories didn't understand was that bipolar disorder has its roots in biology and genetic. in genetics. Now, I'm not saying that's the whole story. There's more to this disorder than simply that. There are environmental stressors and triggering events. But the newer research on bipolar disorder suggests again and again that there are genetic vulnerabilities tied to this disorder. Now, when I say genetic vulnerabilities, I'm not talking about simple genetic transmission like dominant recessive, blue eyes, brown eyes. We're talking about what's called polygenetic influences, or polygenic, P-O-L-Y, which means many. There is no one or two genes in the human genome that code for bipolar disorder. And we're going to hear this again when we get to schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has strong roots in genetics. We know that. But it's not one or two pieces of the human genome. So the genetic vulnerability for bipolar disorder is a complicated one. But let me give you a couple of rough statistics on the genetic vulnerability. If you have no genetic biological family history of bipolar disorder, you have about a 1.5% chance of developing it in your lifetime. Now, 1.5% is very small, but it's above zero, right? So even without a genetic history, that there may be a small vulnerability. But if you have one biological parent who's bipolar, even if you're not raised by that parent, your risk goes up to somewhere between 12 to 18%. Some studies a little bit higher than that, right? So just having one biological parent, even if they're not the parent that nurtures you and raises you and teaches you how to be you, your risk goes up significantly. If both your biological parents uh, were bipolar and you're the biological child and you're not raised by them, your risk is up somewhere around 40%. And that's a significant risk. Now, obviously, if this was just genetic, the risk would be significantly higher. So there must be other factors that are involved. But this is part of the story of this disorder. And what does it mean to say genetic? It means that the brain anatomically, neurologically, neurotransmitter wise, chemically, develops differently. And there may be many different things going on in the brain of somebody who's bipolar. Certainly, part of the story has to do with neurotransmitter imbalances, and perhaps specifically serotonin imbalances, norepinephrine, dopamine imbalances, and another neurotransmitter abbreviated GABA, G-A-B-A. And GABA is implicated in both the bipolar disorder as well as certain other sorts of problems, including, interestingly, alcoholism. And there is an interesting link between substance abuse and bipolarity. It's one of those old chicken and egg sorts of things, in the sense that people who are bipolar and untreated have a very significant risk of substance abuse addiction. And that may be simply because people who are bipolar are self-medicating. And when they're too high, they might self-medicate with downers. And when they're too low, they might self-medicate with stimulant sorts of drugs. Or there may be neurologically and biochemically a shared sort of genetic and neurotransmitter problem. So that's not really clear yet. That's one of those things that's kind of being researched. So the newer etiologies of bipolar disorder recognize that there are biological, neuroanatomical, the physical, the neurology of the brain itself, and genetic factors that are going on. But like lots of disorders, it also takes certain sorts of real life stressful events to pull the trigger. And it is probably not accidental that for a lot of people, the onset of the first episode of bipolarity is somewhere in adolescence. And that may be linked partly to some of the stressors that we all face as we enter adolescence. So for somebody who's not prone to becoming bipolar, they may develop anxiety symptoms, or they may develop straight-on unipolar mood disorder symptoms. But somebody who may be genetically loaded and vulnerable for bipolarity, this may be the onset of that disorder. Now, it can be diagnosed later. It's sometimes diagnosed in one's 20s and 30s, and even occasionally in one's 40s. But that age is really unusual. It's usually going to be, the symptoms usually appear earlier on. But just to remind you of that point, one of the reasons it's so important to treat this disorder is to try to prevent the secondary disorders, like substance abuse, that can develop on top of the first one. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about treatments for the bipolar disorder. So the greater that any disorder is tied to biology and brain functioning and genetics, the more we're going to rely on biological interventions. And while there are exceptions, the general trend is most people who are truly bipolar, not misdiagnosed, really bipolar, need meds to stabilize their mood. And if you think about it, because their mood can vary to too far up and too far down, the medication piece can be pretty complicated sometimes. Bipolar folks may need certain medications to stabilize the bottom end and to prevent them from sinking into a severe depression, like antidepressants, but also may need other medications that are called anti-mania meds that kind of keep a lid on the top end. And so lots of folks with bipolar disorder will be treated with one medication, frequently with more than one medication. Now, the old standby treatment for mania, or for bipolar disorder, and specifically to control mania, was lithium. And if you know anything about chemistry, lithium is an element. It's like iron or lead or helium. It was discovered a number of years ago, and some people say it was discovered accidentally, that lithium has a significant anti-mania effect for people who are bipolar. It helps prevent this burst into this highly energized, unfocused sort of manic behavior. Lithium is still used today, but it is often used in combination with other medications, as I said a moment ago, to control the bottom end of the bipolar disorder. So antidepressants, and then a third group of drugs that are called mood stabilizers. Mood stabilizers, years ago, were really almost always used for people who were bipolar. But mood stabilizers today are sometimes used for people who have unipolar major depression, who have not responded well to a straight up antidepressant. Sometimes a mood stabilizer can have a enhanced effect on, it helps the antidepressant work more effectively. So the medications can be pretty complicated, and here's the deal, right? All of these meds have side effects. When you begin to combine 2 or 3 meds together, right, the side effect profile can become more significant. And that's one of the reasons that people who are bipolar sometimes discontinue taking their meds. Frankly, some people find that the side effects are very unpleasant and they don't want to take their meds as a result. There's also another reason, though. Depression is ego dystonic. Mania is sometimes ego dystonic, but is sometimes really ego syntonic. There's this rush of energy and power and grandiosity that makes some people feel very, very alive in the world. Like people who like to do coke know something about what it feels like to be manic, right? That rush of euphoria, that grandiosity, that feeling In depression, there's not enough self-esteem. In mania, there's too much self-esteem, right? The grandiose ideas, I can do anything, I can fly, nothing will stop me, right? That's kind of a rush. So there are folks who are bipolar who are willing to take the antidepressants because depression hurts, but resist taking the anti-mania drugs. Now, if I sound like I'm making that judgmental, I'm not, because sometimes these meds, especially when they're not titrated, when they're not dosed right for one individual, really make a person feel kind of numb and not always comfortably numb. Shout out to you know who. Right? And so there's this flattening that people who are bipolar and on meds will sometimes describe. Now, that flattening can often be addressed by making medication adjustments, but that's going to take some time. And people get frustrated and people don't like the way that makes them feel. So I get it. The downside is, though, without the right meds, most people who are bipolar are going to struggle significantly in the world in terms of holding jobs, in terms of maintaining relationships, in terms of making good life decisions. It's a tough disorder. Um, but I also want to mention that even though there's a strong medication component to this disorder, talk therapies, especially the right kinds of talk therapies, can make an enormous difference. Remember that even if something is happening to you or me that is chemical and biological, it's still happening to you, the unique human being that makes you you. And you've got to make sense of what's happening. You've got to understand it. You've got to struggle with it. You have to engage in the battle, or not battle, and I'm not sure that's the right word, to deal with what you're facing. You have to psychologically come to terms with recognizing and accepting and moving out of denial of that disorder. It sounds a little bit like substance abuse, right? Where even if there are medications that can help somebody deal with the substance abuse, there's other kinds of interventions to just deal with what's happening in your life. So talk therapy is a very important part of working with somebody who's bipolar. It's not just the issue of medication and then I'll see you in 6 months. Um, and there are a lot of different types of talk therapies that work. Certainly CBT and DBT, which we talked about previously, are being used more recently to work with people who are bipolar and also people who have schizophrenia. We'll talk about that down the road a little bit. But group therapy can be very helpful, especially being in a group where the other people are also bipolar. There's a common language and a common understanding there that can be shared and be very, very helpful. Okay, let me just do a quick reread of what I've been talking about. All right. There's always more to talk about, but I'm trying to keep each of these to about 30 minutes, and we're approaching that right about now. And again, if you want to know more on this, the textbook, obviously, and also nimh.nih.gov has a really good database on bipolar disorder. Sure, there's a lot of things I didn't address, but I think I've kind of hit like really the main points of this. Okay, you'll be getting an email from me soon with the date for your next case study, but figure roughly it'll be 2 weeks down the road. And again, I'm giving you a choice in the case book either between the dysthymic disorder or the bipolar disorder. You'll be getting your grades shortly from your third case study, and Linden at sussex.edu. Please make comments on this video so I know you're watching. Say something about the video. I don't know what. Ask questions, make comments, share your point of view, and talk to you very, very soon. Take care.